Long ago, in a wealthy home lived a young couple. There was 27-year-old Edward Chandler. He was a hard-working man who wanted to keep getting richer. Then there was his wife Elizabeth, who was 28. All she wanted was a child. The couple had been trying for a baby for many years. It wasn't until 1778 that they finally discovered they were expecting. She soon had given birth to a little girl. They named her Theodosia. The pair was thrilled to have a little one around. It wasn't long before Elizabeth was pregnant again. While Edward spent his time out working, she remained at home with the little one. Elizabeth was excited that her family was growing. She couldn't wait to have the next baby. She ended up going into an early labor on a stormy afternoon. In 1780, when she tried to get help outside, she was struck by lightning. She ended up giving birth to her little girl alone. She named her Alice, after the trauma of Alice's birth. Elizabeth was afraid to have another child. She spent the next 6 years raising her two girls. Whilst Edward continued to work, she was happy doing just that. But the girls grew quick. Theodosia and Alice were close with one another. Elizabeth went on to teach Theodosia how to knit. She was growing into a brilliant young girl. Later in 1786, Edward and Elizabeth had their third daughter, Evelyn. She was a very cautious baby. In that time, Alice had grown older. She loved to create and enjoyed drawing. In 1788, they had another girl named Margaret. Then in 1790, they had their fifth and final child. Her name was Eleanor. By the time Margaret was 5 years old, her older sister was 15. Theodosia started to fall for a young gentleman named Julius Caesar. Their love grew fast. It wasn't long before he proposed. They were married in 1793 and moved away to the city to start the family. Around the same time, Alice was finding love herself. A wealthy older man by the name of Phineas Vaughan Taylor had taken her interest. They were married shortly after their first meeting. Phineas then moved her into his family's estate. There Alice spent time painting under the sun. With Theodosia and Alice, corner Evelyn was the new older sister. Elizabeth continued teaching the girls how to knit. Through the years, Evelyn found joy picking on her little sister Eleanor. Along with playing pranks around the house, she had met her match when she was older. She fell in love with a boy named Thomas Akiyama. They were married in 1800 and moved away together. At home, Margaret was quite the charmer. She made a friend named Susan. They had become quite close growing up. They weren't allowed to marry, so Margaret was married to someone else instead. They stayed in her family's home. Eleanor was the last remaining child at home. And like her sisters, Eleanor fell for a boy that didn't come from money. His name was Coco, and they were deeply in love. Her family didn't approve of him, but she was willing to sacrifice her lifestyle to be with him. While the years passed and the girls had their own families, Edward and Elizabeth grew old. They passed away in 1806 and have been buried at the local cemetery, but their legacy lives on. After Theodosia was married, she inherited Julius's surname. Her new name was Theodosia Caesar. In 1795, the two of them had their first child, a little boy named Cornelius. He was a sensitive infant. Theodosia was expecting again in 1796. The young couple was excited to give their son a friend. Before they knew it, they welcomed their son Arthur. He was a wiggly infant. Theodosia was often alone with the children while her husband worked. Whenever she had a moment to herself, she experimented in a secret room beneath her home. Later in 1799, they had a daughter. Her name was Prudence. With 3 children running about, Theodosia found serenity in her tinkers and experiments. The boys were getting older. Cornelius developed a passion for writing and would often write stories in his room. Arthur inherited his mother's love for science. In 1803, Julius and Theodosia had one more child, a little girl named Beatrice. Together they are the Caesars. After Beatrice was born, Theodosia had an idea for a new invention. It took years to create, until it was finally finished. Theodosia had successfully invented the first robot. She called it Caesar CTN. It was programmed to do housework and care for children. By then, Prudence was old enough to care for herself. She had a deep love for music and was highly skilled at violin. Beatrice was still quite young. She relied on Caesar to care for her while her parents were busy. She loved robots. Cornelius continued to write as he got older. He met a girl named Mary who loved his stories. It wasn't long before he asked for her hand in marriage. They moved into their own home in 1810 and had a son named Apollo in 1811. At home, Theodosia made friends with a boy named Demario Valentino. He loved her music and was always there to listen whenever she played. They shared a bond over their love for music. In all that time, Beatrice had grown. With the kids growing and her inventions taking care of the house, Theodosia had a lot of time to herself while Julius worked. Since Cornelius was born, Arthur finally had his own room. There he worked on projects much like his mother. Caesar helped, but something unexpected happened. Arthur started to fall for the robot. They kept their relationship a secret. However, it wasn't long before everyone's peace was interrupted. Julius had become incredibly ill. His illness made him unable to work, and eventually bedridden. Theodosia stayed with him through it all the way until the end. Julius passed away in 1813 at 38 years old. The entire family was there to mourn him. Beatrice cried the most. He passed on her 10th birthday. Every birthday after that was full of dread. Prudence was just 14 when her father died. Demario was there to console her. For the next 3 years their love blossomed. When he proposed, she said yes right away. He moved her into his family's estate. She plays for him every day. In that time, Beatrice had become a young woman herself. She had her eye on an older man named Humphrey Porter. Despite having a family of his own, he didn't hide his interest from her, thus beginning an affair between them. Theodosia never recovered after her husband's death. She kept to herself and barely spoke to her children. One night in 1818, she went to sleep and never woke up. She had passed at the age of 40 and was buried next to Julius. Fortunately for them, their legacy will continue. All that is left of them now are their children. Alice is the second daughter to Edward and Elizabeth Chandler. She was born in the year 1780. She met Finian when she was 16 and he was 32. After they married, she inherited his surname, Von Taylor. They were deeply in love, but Finian wasn't always kind and loving. Alice often painted as a way to escape his outbursts. In 1798 they had a son. They named him Bartholomew. In 1799 they had another son named Godfrey. Then in 1801 they had their final child, Cain. Together they were the Von Taylors. Through the years, Finian became more abusive. Alice was often the victim to it. But as the boys aged, they had also become victims to it. Finian did not hold back against his sons. He showed them no affection and had zero tolerance for misbehavior. Godfrey often hid in his room to avoid his father. Finian was easily provoked by Cain, who was a little younger. Because of this, Cain would pick fights with his brother to feel better. Alice was their only moral compass. Unlike Alice, they had an escape. The boys liked to explore whenever their father was angry. They always argued and broke into fights. The boys enjoyed their freedom and would stay out late. One night, Cain and Bartholomew got into an argument. Godfrey started to drown. Bartholomew and Cain were too busy to notice their brother in danger. When they finally did, it was too late. Godfrey von Taylor passed away in 1810 at just 9 years old. Cain felt bad for being so mean to his brother. He blamed himself for his death. After Godfrey's death, the boys were no longer allowed out. Alice often went into Godfrey's room. Part of her expected him to be there. Finian started to drink a lot more. He would take his anger out on Alice and the boys. He blamed them for Godfrey's death. One night he couldn't control himself. He had strangled her until she fell lifeless to the floor. When he realized what he had done, it was too late. Unfortunately, Alice passed away in 1810. She was 30. The boys mourned her while Finian stayed home. Cain blamed his father for his mother's death and became a very angry person. He got into many fights as a release. That didn't change as the years passed. He was still upset about the death of his brother and mother. He despised his brother for moving on and hated his father for never talking about it. Meanwhile, Bartholomew found love. Her name was Jane Silversweater, and she was stunning. Bartholomew was completely in love with her. He asked her to marry him, and she said yes. He moved her in and introduced her to the family. During that time, Finian had caught a deadly illness. Most of his time was spent ill in his room. However, Jane seemed very fond of Cain, and he was fond of her. They started an affair behind Bartholomew's back. It didn't take long before Bartholomew grew suspicious. When he confronted Jane, she confessed the truth. He was really upset by this. But despite his emotions, he forgave her. He was more upset with Cain. As much as he told him off, Cain didn't care. Bartholomew grew frustrated and hit him, but Cain's temper was worse than his. Jane was shocked to see what Cain had done and gave him a piece of her mind. Still, she was head over heels for him. She later told Bartholomew that Cain was who she truly loved and ended their engagement. Around the same time, Finian had passed away. Bartholomew started drinking as Jane's love for his brother grew. They were happy and he hated it. The worst part for him was Cain didn't love her the way he did. Still, they were expected to marry soon. Bartholomew knew he couldn't be his brother, so he came up with another way to get rid of him. He had Cain's favorite meal prepared with a secret ingredient. Cain sat down and ate as he normally would. He enjoyed it, but it made him a little nauseous. He went to bed that night with an upset stomach. Later, Cain woke up with a terrible feeling. The pain was so unbearable that it killed him. Jane didn't realize that he was gone until the next morning. Cain had passed away at 16 years old in 1817. Jane was absolutely devastated. Bartholomew was there for her and their love resurfaced. He soon proposed to her again and she said yes. They moved into a new estate where they were married. Jane discovered she was pregnant very early in their marriage. When she broke the news to Bartholomew, he seemed excited. But Jane knew that baby was Cain's and was afraid to tell that to Bartholomew, so she kept that to herself. Evelyn was born in 1786. She is the third daughter to Edward and Elizabeth Chandler. She married Thomas in 1800 and took the surname Akiyama. In 1803 they had their first child, a little girl named Genevieve. In 1804 they had a son named Augustus. Then in 1808 they had another son, Jonathan. They are the Akiyamas. Thomas loved to perform and acted in the theatre for work. As Genevieve grew up, she had inherited the same passions. She would practice acting in the mirror when she wasn't picking on her little brother. Augustus had also grown with a particular passion himself. He had a love for playing piano. Evelyn spent a lot of her time knitting when she wasn't doing housework. Thomas and Evelyn always made time for each other when they could. Little Jonathan was growing fast. He liked to pull pranks. He especially loved messing with Augustus. As Genevieve aged, she never stopped acting in the mirror. Thomas coached her. She looked up to him. One night while performing a fight scene, Thomas fell off stage. He had a bad landing and couldn't survive his injuries. He passed at the age of 39 in 1817. The family was devastated. Time passed and the kids grew up. Romance blossomed between Genevieve and the young boy. His name was Dmitri Harbour. Things moved quick between them. It wasn't long before they were married. They moved into a small home together in 1820. Although Genevieve didn't get many roles, she never stopped acting around the house. Augustus never stopped playing the piano. He met a girl named Lindsay who loved to listen. She inspired him to compose music for her. It wasn't long before feelings were caught. Augustus soon proposed, to which Lindsay said yes. They were moved into a lovely home while Augustus continues to write music. Meanwhile at home, Evelyn had met someone new. His name was Franklin Crawford and he had also lost a spouse. The two were married and Franklin moved in. Her children didn't approve of her replacing their father, especially Jonathan, who still lived at home when Evelyn remarried. The marriage had definitely damaged their relationship. Besides the tension with his mother, he was often in his own world. But that changed when he met a girl. They moved in together where they are soon to be wed. In 1823, Evelyn and Franklin were expecting. They had a little girl named Victoria. Then, in 1825, they had a son named Nicholas. After his birth, she had become terribly ill and was bedridden. Unfortunately, her illness couldn't be cured and she never got better. She died that year and was buried beside Thomas. Franklin was left to mourn yet another spouse. Margaret Chandler was born in 1788. She is Elizabeth and Edward's fourth daughter. When she was 9 years old, she met a girl named Susan. They became best friends. As the years passed, they grew even closer. They were in love but could not marry. There was a man by the name of John J. Jones who found interest in Margaret. However, when he proposed, she declined. Margaret's heart was already set on someone else. Susan told her that she was arranged to marry. The lucky man was Roll Jefferson. They were married in 1815. After Susan was married, Margaret didn't get to see her as much. She had eventually went on to marry John in 1818. Despite their separate lives, the girls continued to write letters to each other. In those letters, Susan wrote how miserable her marriage was. Roll was cruel to her every day. She couldn't put up with it anymore. She knew there was only one way to get rid of him. She did what had to be done to be with her love again. After Roll's death, she went back to Margaret after spending years apart. They found out they were both pregnant. Margaret convinced her husband to move Susan in and their love was rekindled. John spent time in the study when he wasn't working. He was unaware. In 1820, the girls gave birth to their children. Margaret had a girl. She named her Gertrude. Susan had a little boy. His name was Louis. The girls were happy to raise their children together. The best part was the children got along well. They were becoming best friends themselves. Susan had a good relationship with Louis. Margaret taught Gertrude to knit, the same way her mother did her, but Gertrude was much closer with her father. Margaret and Susan were close with each other's children as well. With all the years that passed, their relationship was still kept a secret. John never found out. but he had secrets of his own. He had taken an interest in their maid. Her name was Tallulah. They started an affair that ended with her getting pregnant. John feared that Margaret would find out, so he fired her. She was kicked out and left on her own. Time had passed and the children had grown. Gertrude was interested in boys, but no one seemed interested in her. Louis was the only one who was. The two were still very close. Louis was the one to make the move that changed their relationship forever. The two of them started messing around without their parents' knowledge. But it didn't last long. A man by the name of Charles Hathaway had fallen for Gertrude. Her feelings for him were mutual and things moved fast between them. Gertrude politely told Louis that they couldn't be with each other anymore. He took the news well, but deep down he was upset he couldn't be with her. He loved her. Later, in 1838, Charles and Gertrude were married. Charles moved her into his family's estate in a different city. Louis and Gertrude never stopped being friends. He eventually found someone special, but no one could compare to Gertrude. He moved to the same town as her so they could be close. As the years went on, Susan and Margaret had aged. Despite the grey hair and wrinkles, their love was still young. After John's death in 1840, they no longer had to hide their love. They spent the next 14 years together before their deaths in 1857. While Margaret was buried beside John, Susan was not far. This story is based off of true events. Eleanor Chandler was born in 1790. She is the fifth daughter to Edward and Elizabeth Chandler. When she was 15, she met a boy named Coco Todeccini. The two of them hit it off. Coco was different than any boy she's ever met. Her parents didn't approve of him, so they ran away together. Eleanor was happy with him. She wouldn't want it any other way. Coco taught her how to hunt. The two of them were soon expecting. They went on to build a shelter for their growing family. Eleanor gave birth to a healthy baby girl in 1806. They named her Muriel. A few months later, their home was finally finished. They even managed to have their own livestock. Most of their days were spent farming. Coco often crafted furniture when he wasn't hunting. While Coco built the furniture, Eleanor would knit clothes and blankets. They had another little girl in 1808. Her name was Winona. Her and her sister were close. They had another baby in 1812, a little boy. They named him Nahile. With the kids growing, they were able to help around with the chores. Muriel loved taking care of the animals. Eleanor taught the girls how to knit as well. In 1821, they welcomed another little girl. Her name was Sequoia. They then had another boy in 1824. His name was Onakona. In this time, the girls had become young women. Eleanor developed a hobby for arranging flowers. The family was incredibly close. The family would spend nights telling each other stories. It had become a tradition of theirs. Nahile had become old enough for Coco to teach him how to hunt. He showed Nahile how to use a bow and arrow to prepare him. Whenever they hunted, Coco let Nahile roam on his own. One day he stumbled across something strange. Nahile was fascinated by a creature he had never seen before. The creature wasn't as nice as it first seemed. It attacked him. Coco had heard his son's cries and came as quick as he could. He carried a dying Nahile all the way home, but it was already too late. Nahile had passed away in 1824 at 12 years old. He was buried on their grounds. His death shook the entire family. Coco felt guilty for not being there when his son needed him most. He would do anything to get him back. After Nahile passed, nothing was the same. Coco and Eleanor had one more child in 1829, a little boy named Jacques. In 1830, a strange man came to their home and told them they had to leave. Coco refused and told the man he had no right, but the man threatened to harm them if they didn't do otherwise. They were given no choice but to leave everything they built behind. They traveled 4 miles in many conditions in search for a new place to call home. They would bathe whenever they came across a body of water. Coco tried to make things better by telling stories by the fire the way they used to. He helped keep the family's spirits up. They were on their feet for a while. Eventually, the exhaustion had caught up to them. Sequoia had become quite ill. She had become too sick to walk any further, so the family stayed put for a while. Coco took Muriel out to catch fish while the family got some rest. They later went to sleep. Early that morning, Eleanor noticed Sequoia wasn't breathing. She had passed away in her sleep at the age of 9. They buried her in an unmarked grave before continuing their journey. They traveled further for many more months. But Docker grew fussy as he caught a cold. Coco tried his best to keep him calm, but the family feared for his health. As Docker's condition grew worse, they stumbled upon a plot of land. They went straight to work to build shelter. They took turns watching the little ones. They worked in the worst of conditions, but by then they were used to it. With weeks of building, they eventually had a structure to live in. Within a year, it was finally finished. In that time, Docker had gotten better. They had a memorial for Nahile and Sequoia to always remember them. At the end of every day, the family gathers for storytelling the way they always used to.